Okay, so I'm working on a project called the Open Source Observatory, which is managed by the European Commission, and it is, no, that should not be blue. Oh well. So I'm working on OSOR. The general goals of OSOR are to help the free software community, in particular in public administrations, for them to use free software. So we have a bunch of projects going at the same time. We have a website, the Open Source Observatory, OSOR, where we publish free software and open source news. We have a knowledge center where we're gathering information on case studies of countries that are using free software. We have intelligence reports on who in each country is involved in different parts of free software. And we have summaries of all the policies that they have in place. We organize community events. So this year we will organize 3 workshops and 3 webinars. And from each of these workshops and webinars, we will be producing a report. And then the latest project we've taken on is that we're going to compile these reports together into a handbook at the end of the year. And this is going to be kind of best practices on how to use free software in public administration. So we'll be looking at different policies that people have in place. Do they work? The folks will be on finding experts that have already gotten free software into use on desktops and servers and services in public administration. We're going to look at all the projects, the problems that they've encountered, and we're going to try and find the solutions that they've found for all these different problems. But as part of the OSOR work, we also try and get information out to the free software community to help people interact with how the European Commission is working on all these regulations that are going to affect the free software community. So this is part of there is a procedure for gathering input and doing calls for evidence, but the Commission also works through people like myself to find the free software community where you are, and then bring the information, collect feedback, and try and get people to contribute into the process of making these new regulations. So in particular today, I'm going to talk about Interoperable Europe Act. Now, because we had a change in the schedule, I've got a bit of extra time. So what I want to do is I want to make this more of an interactive session. Not the first half. The first half is going to be me reading slides, but the second half is where I would like to get input from everyone here. And so what we're doing is I'm going to present the Interoperable Europe Act, and I'd like to discuss then how something like an Interoperable Europe Act can help the free software open source community, and then in what way can the community and the Commission and the various bodies that are created by this Act, how can they all collaborate to work together? So in general, interoperability. The idea is to help governments and computer systems to interoperate and share data. This often happens at a national level already. It's already difficult at that stage, but the Interoperable Europe Act is going to work on this at the European level. And so the type of problems it's trying to solve are, for example, very simple problems like reserving a parking space for your car once you travel into the next country across the border, and you have to type in the registration plate of your car. If the registration plate isn't in the standard format, then that system may not allow you to reserve a parking space. A little bit more complicated, something like hospital beds. So the idea is that if a Belgian hospital phones a French hospital and asks, do you have a bed free? And France says, yes, we have 1 bed. Then a Dutch hospital phones the same French hospital and they say, do you have a bed free? Well, what is the answer? Is it 1 or 0, or is it somewhere between the two? And so the whole idea is that the idea of data sharing and trying to get all these hospital systems to work together is generally more complicated than expected. You have to have either a reservation system or a priority system which is understandable to all the other 27 member states. So these things get pretty complicated. The member states generally manage to get this to work on their own systems because there's a government at the top that can tell the hospitals, please have a system that works with all these other systems, or make sure that you can interoperate. The European Union can't do that because the European Union doesn't have authority over the hospitals of Belgium and the hospitals of France and the hospitals of the Netherlands. So the European Union can't tell the hospitals what to do. So the Interoperable Europe Act is about setting a standard that will apply to the member states for how they will interoperate with how they will interact with their hospitals, and systems for reserving car parking spaces and other things to make all these systems work across borders as well as they are working within the borders already. So that's on interoperability, and then there's also the idea of data sharing. And so this is the third example of when a city wants to introduce some kind of traffic management system. They may find that other cities across Europe have already done something similar, and they might find a good example. But will that data be available to them, or will the system that has been created by that other member state, will that be available to this city so they can use the same framework and so they can learn from the same information that the successful city learned from. So the current situation is that we have the European Interoperability Framework. This is the main piece of legislation. It's been updated a few times. The most recent version was updated in 2017. The main difference between this and what is being proposed at the moment is that the 2017 text is non-binding. So this works on the goodwill and cooperation between member states, but it's not. No member states are not required to do anything through this system. So then there are also other informal ways that cooperation has been helped. There is the Digital Europe programme and the Join Up platform. So the Join Up platform is a website where, for example, the Open Source Observatory is situated. And this is a place where a lot of different projects from the European Commission are available online, and they can share solutions and code repositories and general information, articles. And this is another way that interoperability has been helped, but again, it's a voluntary idea because it's making information available in the hope that people will use it if they'd like to use it. And then the third way that interoperability has been worked on already is through this informal network of CIOs from the member states and the expert group on interoperability of European public services. So this is the human side, getting individuals to talk to each other and trying to get interoperability to happen that way. So this is useful, but it could be a lot more useful in terms of making the cooperation between all these cities and member states more efficient. It could be good to lay down a set of minimum interoperability specifications, ways of sharing data, not just formats, but the technical specifications for how data will be shared and communicated. And then the third part is the idea of a binding requirement to have interoperability by default as an approach when designing new systems, and also to promote designing systems that are interoperable. So the European Commission has been gathering information, and this is the standard procedure when making a new regulation. They do a call for evidence, a call for input. They work on impact assessments. They talk to their own research centres, which is the JRC, the Joint Research Centre, and part of that is the CEPS, the Centre for European Policy Studies. They've gone through these systems. They did online consultations, and they've got 134 for the impact assessment, 112 replies for the European Interoperability Framework. They also perform then interviews with specialists or stakeholders in all these domains. And then presentations like this are the little annex on this, because from all this, they've talked to a load of experts, but has anyone in the room been involved in any of these procedures? One. Okay, that's two. Fantastic. So for everyone else in the room, this is a way that the European Commission, this presentation is a way that the European Commission is trying to get information to the public and to the free software community in particular, so that people can participate and be aware of what can be participated in. So the Interoperable Europe Act is not the only piece of legislation that is currently in force or being worked on. We already have the Single Digital Gateway, where member states have an automated cross-border exchange of documents. There is the Open Data Directive, which is for the European Interoperability Framework for designing technical solutions for the reuse of documents. The European Strategy for Data, which is about interoperability of data. The Data Governance Act, which is cross-sector data, supporting the Interoperable Europe Framework principles and the core vocabularies of these. The digitalization of justice, which is a general trend, which is to make the IT tools used by the justice systems interoperable with each other. And then there are two pieces of legislation that are currently still going through the legislative process. So these are things that you can still get involved in. And one is the Data Act, which is on interoperability of data through among different sectors within Europe. And then we also have the regulation on digital identity. And this is where member states have to have digital identity wallets. And this is to create a standard so this can interoperate between the different member states. So the European Interoperability Act will be beside, or in some cases on top of these existing pieces of legislation. So the general goals are to create a consistent approach to Europe interoperability and to policy making across the member states, to establish an interoperability governance structure. So this I'll discuss a little bit later how exactly that will work and how people here can be involved in that. But this is the second, besides the technical issues of how technically interoperability should happen, there's also the governance of all these different structures that will be created and how that governance should interact with users and experts. Then the last part is the idea of creating an ecosystem, a general environment for the EU's public sector so that people can contribute to interoperable solutions and people are aware of what interoperable solutions exist already, and so that this innovation can happen in a collaborative way so that there is more reuse of code, because we've seen quite a lot of countries now have gotten to the stage of accepting free software as a good idea, and they publish a lot of source code for the things they're doing, but we don't yet see a lot of instances where a city from one member state will copy a solution from another member state and start even contributing back to that solution. So this is the next step in terms of collaboration and making a good use of free software is the idea of an ecosystem and getting the collaborative innovation to happen. So inside the Interoperable Europe Act, there are these 6 chapters. I'm going to focus on 3 of them. The general idea is that it is a mandatory interoperability that comes with assessments and support and solutions that already exist and encouraging people to create new solutions. But these pieces of text are from the actual Interoperable Europe Act. So at the moment, what we have is the European Commission has published their proposal. This then gets handed to the European Parliament, which are the directly elected members of the Parliament there. So these are often the easiest to interact with for people who are not too involved in the legislative process. It is also handed to the European Council, which is the ministers or the governments of the member states. So this is a second group that will be looking at the text from the Commission, and they will think about whether to accept it as is or whether they should propose amendments. So this means the legislative proposal for creating the Interoperable Europe Act is still ongoing. It's still something that it's actually in the fairly early stages even, and it's still something where people can get involved, and that's what I'm hoping to facilitate here. So this is one piece of text from the current proposal for an Interoperable Europe Act. This is the share and reuse requirement, and it is one of the parts that definitely directly will affect the free and open source software community. So what is probably interesting in this is the idea that they've created a piece of text to encourage the sharing of solutions, and so this is what we are quite used to in the free software community, but their definition or the way they describe this is that if the solutions, and which solutions will generally mean software, solutions shall be made available to any such entity that requests it and shall include documented source code. So that's their current definition of what it should look like to have member states working together on solutions such as software. So this is what the Parliament will now look at, and the Council, and what we can interact with the Parliament and the Council to decide, can this be improved? Should this be adopted as is? Or if other people want to change it, we can give our opinion on whether it should be kept or whether other changes should be included. So this is one part that I'd like to get some input on at the end of this session. So if you have any comments on how that, whether this definition is ideal or not, that would be interesting. The second part is in chapter 2, which is quite a long chapter, but I've only included a small amount here. Maybe the most interesting points are that there will be the creation of the Interoperable Europe portal, which is a place where it'll be possible to share solutions and data and to create some kind of interaction between people who are interested in this topic and to increase transparency of how work is being done on this. One interesting part of Article 8 is that there is somewhat a definition of what free software / open source is. So it says here, I'll highlight some bits. An open source license means a license whereby the reuse of software is permitted for all specified uses in a unilateral declaration by the right holder and where the source codes of the software are made available for users. So this is the first time I've seen free software or open source license being defined in a European regulation. Once again, this is something that we will have to think about and accept input on and decide whether this is the way it should be defined or are there improvements that could be made. The second most interesting part in Article 3 is that the EUPL, the European Union Public Licence, is suggested as the default licence for public administration's publishing source code solutions. The EUPL, which I'll just present briefly, is a valid free software license. It's approved by Free Software Foundation and Open Source Initiative as well. It is a somewhat copyleft license. So the EUPL itself includes a copyleft clause. So if you're using the EUPL and you publish software and if somebody else modifies it, they also have to publish their source code. So it's quite a traditional copyleft in that sense. But it has a compatibility clause, and the compatibility clause says if you're merging EUPL source code with another project under a license that's listed in the annex, you can change the EUPL license to the license of that project. So this means, for example, the GPLv3 is one of the licenses in the annex. So if you have a GPLv3 project and an EUPL project, you can merge the two and distribute the whole thing under GPLv3. This is one way, a very positive, a very useful clause they've inserted to work on license compatibility, which between copyleft licenses is always difficult. On the other hand, there are also licenses in the annex of the EUPL which are not copyleft licenses or not strong copyleft licenses, and so it's possible that the EUPL software would be merged with a software project which is under a non-strong copyleft license, and then the whole would be distributed without being under strong copyleft. So in one sense it's copyleft license, but also there's no guarantee that downstream uses of that code will remain copyleft. So that is the most unique part of the EUPL, I believe. And a second aspect that is quite interesting of the EUPL is that it has been translated into all the official languages of the European Union, which is quite useful because some member states or cities have requirements in their law saying that they can only sign contracts that are under their own official languages. So if there's any difficulty with getting software put under, for example, GPLv3, because the GPLv3 is in English, there's always the option of getting the software published under EUPL, and it can be kept under EUPL or can be later converted into GPLv3. So that is the EUPL. It's getting more and more use at the moment. So here's just a map with a few examples of member states that are currently using the EUPL. But once the Interoperable Europe Act comes into force, if the current wording is kept, the EUPL will presumably be used by a lot more member states and local governments, and so it is a license that we're going to be seeing more and more use of. So the Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are the technical aspects of the EUPL. Then Chapter 4 contains the governance structure. So this part is how interaction is going to be done with experts and with member states. And so the Interoperable Europe Act proposes making an Interoperable Europe Board and then an Interoperable Europe Community. So these two will work together, the board having a more executive function, the community having more of an input role. They will both interact with national authorities, and national authorities will be required to create national assessment bodies, and there will be interoperability coordinators. The details of how all this will work might look a little complicated, might be a bit complicated as well, but is also not completely defined at the moment. So there have been statements at conferences to say that the free software community will be included in the Interoperable Europe Community. And the fact that this has been explicitly mentioned by high-ranking people in the Commission means that it should be quite a real role. Which means, as a community, we now have to think about how do we want to be involved in an Interoperable Europe Community. If we are to have representatives, how do we choose these? If we are to work with the Interoperable Europe Board, what exactly would we be requesting, or what would we be suggesting? And so this is where I will soon come to the interactive part, because this will be up to us to think about how can an interoperability framework help the free and open source software community? How can it help the software itself in terms of data formats? What can we do to make sure the data formats and the systems that use them are systems that can be used by existing free software solutions? Or if we're developing new solutions, what do we need to make sure that these things are all can all be made use of by the free software and open source community? So that is the general idea of the Interoperable Europe Act. It will have all these positive outcomes: legal certainty, of course, more innovation, more agility for public administrations, and connected digital public services. But the reason I'm giving this talk here today is because I would like to have your suggestions. Possibly, I was about to suggest, possibly from the people who've already been involved in these various procedures. But do we have a microphone for questions, or how do we do it?
So if you could repeat any questions you get, so that
Yep.
they're audible on the live stream, because
Yep.
you've got the only mic on your shirt.
Yeah, and people aren't going to come over here and start. Okay, first question, yes.
Yes, so the definition of that you showed, was there an attempt to coordinate with the definitions, for example, the definition of open standards, or the open definition by the Open Knowledge Foundation, these kind of things?
I'm not sure, because a lot of... Oh yeah. So the question was, has there been work, while drafting the text of the Interoperable Europe, has there been work to coordinate with the definition of open standards and the Open Knowledge Centre's work on defining open standards? Is that correct? Yes. So when the European Commission is writing their initial proposal for legislation, a lot of it is behind the actual drafting. It happens internally in the Commission. So they will have consulted with certain experts, and when they did the call for input, it would have been possible for Open Knowledge Centre or any of these organisations to participate during that stage. A lot of the time, these things get missed by people who should be interested in these topics, and that's partly just because there are so many different pieces of regulation going through the systems that we can't be aware of everything that's happening. So it's possible that they have not been involved during the elaboration of the text up until now, but this stage of the legislative process, where the text then gets handed over to the Parliament and to the Council and is visible to the general public, this is where there is now a chance for everyone involved to comment on the text, and that's what I'm here today to make sure that people who weren't aware of it until now are aware and can start participating. So we had one other person. Okay, yeah.
I was wondering, is this going to be, so it's called an act, but is it going to be more like a regulation or a directive thing? So basically how enforceable, because it looks great, but how enforceable might it be?
It is a regulation. I didn't have the word on the slides, so now I'm actually drawing a slight blank. But the text is publicly available. As far as I remember, it's a regulation, and so it would be directly enforceable rather than a directive has to be implemented by the member state. So there's one step of implementation there. But it will be a regulation. So that is it will be binding to all the member states. Yes. Oh, sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. Yes.
Question is, do you have a sense, now that it's proposed by the Commission, it's going to go to Parliament and Member States, do you have a sense of what the Member States' views are on this? Do they like it? Do they hate it? Do you expect a lot of changes? And also, how capable do you think are the members of the European Parliament who are responsible for this in the committee right now?
Okay, so the question is what the general feeling is on whether the text will be changed now, or what the member states and the Parliament think about it, and what their capacity is or the capability is for dealing with topics such as this. So we have not yet gotten much feedback from the member states. There are a lot of pieces of legislation going through the system at the moment, partly because there will be a new set of policymakers elected next year, and so there is somewhat of a rush to get some piece of legislation through. Technical topics like this are always a little bit difficult for policymakers to work on, and there's always the worry that will our issue get the attention it deserves. But what I've generally found is there are always a few people in the Parliament who do understand this topic. They understand whichever topic gets given to them. There are also in the Council, each member state has their own set of experts, and they will have somebody who is an expert on, it could be standard setting or it could be digital solutions, but they will have people who do understand these topics. So it's not so much that the MEPs don't work directly on this themselves, but each MEP in the Parliament, they will have a team of assistants, and each group in the Parliament will also have an external team of policy experts. And so if you're looking at the MEPs and you're wondering, will this person really understand the text, you have to take into account that it's not the MEP on their own who works on the text, it's their office will work on the text. And so within each MEP's office, there will be, each MEP that is going to work on this directly, there should be somebody who understands this, and that's part of the job of anyone who wants to get involved in it, is to identify the people in the Parliament, in the Council, who are the experts and who do understand this, and then try and work with them to improve the text. And then within their groups and within the Parliament, they will generally be seen as an expert, and then so they would have a larger influence on how the text should be changed. Yes, first.
Yes, I don't have directly a question, but more feedback. I think it's something that's shared when I hear the questions. I think it's really key who's at the table, for example, in the community, or during the legislation process, or during the implementation of the legislation. And that already is a big political game to get on the table, to get the right people on the table. But for example, I'm a member of the XMP Standards Foundation. It's all about interoperable chat. I just made a budget what it would cost our foundation to properly react to the Digital Markets Act, which has an interoperable chat clause, and it would cost us about 300k euro. And to participate also in a community input would be really a big stretch for our organization. So I think we could have lots to contribute there, and lots of useful input, because I think that the Digital Market Act could have been much better if they would have consulted us. But we are out of resources to do it. And still, it's a big game who's there and who should be there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So, yeah, shall I repeat the comment? The comment is that it is very important who is at the table and who will be involved in these negotiations and in giving input, and it's always a difficult decision to make on how much how many resources we can put in, a community organisation or even a company can put into participating in this particular legislative procedure, when there are also so many other that are also very important to work on. And yeah, it's a valid comment, and that's like we're trying to make it like through this presentation, through coming to Fosdem. I'm trying to be part of making it easier to participate in this. At least people will be aware of it, and then yeah, it's always whatever can be put into it, it will hopefully be beneficial. But people will, everyone does their best. Sorry, there was. First.
I'm wondering how do you think that this will benefit the general open source community? Because these acts, they say that public agencies must publish as open source, but it doesn't say they must use it. So what I often see is that they just hire a bunch of consultants from Atos or whatever, Gemini, but they don't hire the actual open source developers. They just hire a bunch of people using a consultancy framework contract that these agencies have. And then they just download the free software for free and they say, oh, look how much open source we do. But that doesn't benefit us as a community. How do you think this will improve that? Because I don't see any things that, like what the previous commenter said about funding of the community and supporting the community really. It just says you must make open source, but it doesn't say support the real makers.
Well, so the question is, how will this really benefit free software open source developers if we already have a lot of government agencies who already download free and open source software and they use it, but this doesn't actually lead to contributions to the software, or it doesn't help other people who are writing projects. And so I would say the way this could benefit free software developers is by making public how interoperability will happen. It will make it easier for a project to develop the software necessary to interact with these services in that way. Because at the moment, if we have 27 different ways of reserving a hospital bed somewhere, and if the specifications are not public, well then it's very difficult for a free software developer to come along and say, well, I'm going to write a hospital bed reservation system. But if the specifications and the data formats and the procedures for performing these tasks were transparent and public, and then that's already one step that would be useful. And then if France develops a system and they publish the source code for theirs, and Belgium develops a system and they publish the source code for theirs, then this also gives us reference implementations for how to interact within these frameworks. And so I think I would have thought that solves the problem you asked. But would you like to do a follow-up comment?
Yeah, I don't think that does, because I think then it's just the consultancy firms that develop these open source solutions. And I mean, as an open source developer, you probably don't invest upfront a lot of money and time to do something. I don't know how you see that. I think then it's still being developed by big companies, not smaller ones.
Okay, is this the same comment? Do you want to?
Yeah, it's actually to add on to his. The thing that I see happening is, of course, I'm from the States, so I have a whole different environment I have to deal with. But they sat there and go, oh, here's billions of dollars for open source. Okay, great. What's the procurement path to that money being distributed? Because all that's going to happen is you're going to have these huge consultancy firms come in. If we're lucky, they dump 8,000 lines of code on us, right? Which doesn't go through our process, doesn't go through any of those things properly. They don't behave correctly. There's all of these different problems that happen. And there's nothing to actually address that piece of the fact that there's not a good procurement process. I know in the States, it's horrible. There's no way an individual developer could ever go through the process to ever see any of that money. It's impossible. I don't know what the processes are like here in the different countries either. But I know that procurement pathway ends up being the thing that's really devastating to actually helping the open source structures that exist. Because most of them actually are nonprofits too. I mean, how many of them are set up as actual nonprofit structures, and do we have a clean way to get that government money? No, you have to go through, you have to be a business, and you have to be a business of a certain size.
Okay, so the question then is, the question is how do free software developers get access to the funding for developing free software in public administrations, and how do you avoid that all this money gets given to big consultancy firms who dump code without participating in community procedures, and the procurement rules will not be of any use to free software companies who would be able to do proper collaboration with the community. Procurement is a national level competence. So the European Commission is not going to be telling member states how to work on procurement. What will happen with interoperability is that the formats and the procedures and the frameworks will become transparent, and there will be reference implementations at least available. So in that sense, where it was very difficult to interoperate with all these public administrations, it should be with open specifications and with source code that implements these. It should be a lot easier at the very least. Who ends up getting paid to develop the software, that is something that will be dealt with outside of this legislation, and it'll have to be worked on in some other text, probably at the national level. But, yeah.
Two for you.
Quickly.
Willingness in the Commission or recognition that maybe we shouldn't just dump all this on GitHub and have a platform within the European Union that is used to host this code? And the follow-up on that is, are there any AI training clauses in this license?
So the two questions are, should the European Commission have their own code hosting website instead of using GitHub, and are there any AI clauses? AI is not in this, but there is also an AI Act which is currently going through the legislative process, and so that's something where it's still halfway through the legislative process. If people want to get involved in that, that'd be very useful. GitHub, the European Commission's code sharing site is code.europa.info. So this is something they put online, I think, last October. And so they have their own code hosting site, and this is one of the ways they hope to encourage projects from the European Union to collaborate and work together. And so yes, it won't be on GitHub. Yes?
This is only for European institutions and not for local governments?
At the moment, I believe the projects that are there are only European institutions, but it is also, the goal is for it to be broadened out, and I expect that it will also be for local governments. But it is only online the last 3 or 4 months, so that's the start. Sorry, the question there was what goes on the code.europa portal. Do you have time for one more question?
We have time for two.
Two, okay.
Getting consensus among the 60 member states of Germany. So the standards within each member state of the European Union are also really different, and getting a consensus there is hard.
Yeah. So the Interoperable Europe Act, so the question is there any consideration for the complexity within a member state in terms of implementing all these different IT systems? The Interoperable Europe Act will focus on making sure that interoperability is possible. Now, whether how complex it is for a country which has 60 regions, or in Belgium where you've got 7 governments, how difficult it is for these things to work together is still something that the member states have to work on themselves. Each member state can define their own number of regions and provinces and communes and communities, and that is something they all have to deal with. So those technical solutions won't be solved by the Interoperable Europe Act, but by making specifications, file formats and procedures transparent, it might have the knock-on effect of also making it easier to work on those problems.
You mentioned the European Commission doesn't want to interrupt into the procurement practices in national states. Why not? It could be harmonized in all of Europe, so consultancies, public, open source communities can work across borders.
So the question is why the European Commission wouldn't get involved in procurement policies in member states, and the answer is mostly that for certain member states certain things are very sensitive, and there are some things that some people wish was at a European level, and for other people it is completely unacceptable that this would be at the European level. And so even within public procurement, if you're going to have a national policy, then you also have to think about regional governments and local governments and communities. So it would be very difficult to get agreement across all these different institutions for everyone to say, yes, the European Commission is the person who should define how the region of Southwest Dublin should procure software. So it's just part of the complexity of the European situation.
May I make a suggestion here?
Oh, sorry, there was one question over here, and so I'll just give a chance to people who haven't spoken yet. Yes.
Not me, but okay, thank you. Sort of adding to the discussion, I see that legislation is a good step forward. But on the other hand, open source success depends on the right mindset, on community building and exchange. Is there any initiative ongoing to sort of spread the mindset for using and reusing particular open stuff like that? I mean, it's not done by just publishing. There must be a mindset to take that up and reuse it.
So the question is there any philosophy or mindset or strategy within the European Commission to encourage participation in open source development and collaboration with the community? So the Interoperable Europe Act is one thing. It's about interoperability. There is an open source strategy. There is an open source program office where they participated in a session yesterday on the main stage in the Jensen. And so there are different activities happening within the European Commission to work on this from different angles. This is one that hopefully will help, or if you think it doesn't help enough, please get involved in the legislative process. This is the open part. And yes, but there are other initiatives also. It is something that's slowly expanding within the European Commission. My time is up, so I have to thank you for the input. I'm going to hang around. If people have more questions, I will be available, so thank you all very much.